The first time anyone noticed the young soldier that morning, it was only because a retired banker snapped his fingers at her and said his coffee had gone cold. She was standing beneath a row of framed photographs of the dead, balancing a silver pot in one hand and a tray of cups in the other, while men with polished shoes and old war stories filled the memorial hall with easy laughter. Her dark blue army uniform was half hidden beneath a plain black serving apron, and for a brief, humiliating second, no one seemed to see the rank on her sleeve, the stiffness in her shoulders, or the scar that disappeared beneath her collar. They saw a quiet girl pouring coffee. Nothing more. Then Colonel Benjamin Whitaker looked up from the head table, his gaze drifting past her as if she were part of the furniture, and the young soldier lowered her eyes before anyone could notice how badly that small moment hurt. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing people from around the world listening to these stories. And if stories about courage, sacrifice, and the quiet ways honor survives still mean something to you, consider subscribing and becoming part of this community. The breakfast had been planned for weeks. One of those solemn military community gatherings where white tablecloths tried to soften old grief and brass insignia caught the morning light like little flames. At the front of the hall stood a long table reserved for senior officers, local dignitaries, veterans, and the families whose loved ones had never come home. In the center of that table, there was one empty chair. On the plate in front of it sat a folded card bearing a name no one in the room needed to read twice. Captain Luke Whitaker. Even before the speeches began, the empty chair seemed to command the room more than any living person inside it. People glanced at it between sips. They lowered their voices when they passed it. A pair of old infantrymen removed their caps the first time they saw it and carried them against their chests for the rest of the morning. That chair was why Colonel Whitaker had been invited to speak. It was why the local paper had sent a photographer. It was why specialist Elena Ruiz had agreed to come at all. Not to be seen. To hide. She had arrived before sunrise through the side entrance, carrying a garment bag and an envelope so worn at the corners it looked as though it had survived a war of its own. A sergeant from protocol had met her beside the kitchen and asked if she was certain. There had still been time to take a seat with the other soldiers from the post, time to put her name on the guest list, time to stand where people could see her face and ask questions she had spent 2 years avoiding. Elena had only shaken her head, tied the black apron around her waist, and picked up the first coffee pot. It was easier that way. Easier to move. Easier to keep her hands busy. Easier to leave when the weight in her chest became too much. No one in the hall knew how much courage it had taken for her to walk into that room. Most of them did not know her name. A few had heard it once, long ago, tucked inside a casualty report or spoken in the aftermath of a mission that had taken 4 lives and left 7 others bleeding in the dust. Even fewer knew that the envelope pressing against the inside pocket of her uniform had been there for 26 months, sealed and undelivered, addressed in a dead man's hand to the father now seated beneath the flag at the front of the room. Elena moved from table to table with the steady silence of someone used to going unnoticed. She refilled cups before anyone asked. She stepped around chairs before anyone had to move. Every so often a guest would thank her without really looking at her, and she would nod once, almost gratefully, because being mistaken for part of the staff stung less than being recognized. At the far end of the room, a woman from the auxiliary smiled apologetically and whispered, "Head table first, sweetheart." Elena answered, "Yes, ma'am," in the calm, controlled voice she had learned to use when the wrong response might show too much. She had not always spoken that way. Before the deployment, before the ridge, before the radio traffic that still woke her in the middle of the night, Elena Ruiz had laughed easily and too loudly. She had been the kind of young soldier who jogged to formation even when she had time to spare, who called home on Sundays, who believed duty would make sense if she worked hard enough. At 23, she had already learned how fast that belief could die. The smell of coffee turned dangerous when it sat too long in heated metal. Burnt and bitter, it carried a faint edge that reminded her of scorched wiring and diesel smoke. Twice that morning, she paused near the kitchen door and had to steady her breathing before returning to the tables. Nobody noticed. That was the strange thing about crowded rooms. A person could be drowning quietly in the middle of one and still remain invisible. At 10 o'clock sharp, the chaplain stepped to the lectern and asked for silence. Chairs stopped scraping. Cups lowered. A child near the back was hushed by his mother. The room rose for the national anthem, then settled again into a respectful stillness broken only by the occasional clink of porcelain. Elena stood beside the sideboard, coffee pot in hand, her eyes lowered. When Colonel Whitaker stood, the hall seemed to straighten with him. He was a large man gone lean with age and discipline, the kind of officer whose back still looked too rigid for civilian life. His silver hair was cut close. His dark suit could not hide the habit of command in his shoulders. He thanked the veterans, the organizers, the families. He spoke with the measured control of someone who had delivered hard news before and survived it by never allowing his voice to shake in public. The microphone barely altered him. He sounded the way old parade grounds looked, formal, weathered, unbending. Elena kept her face still, but she could not stop herself from looking at him. Not because he was famous on post, because he had Luke's eyes. It was there in the calm gray of them, though age had hardened what youth had once softened. It was there in the line of his jaw when he paused between sentences. It was there, most painfully, in the way he kept glancing toward the empty chair as if part of him still expected his son to walk in late and apologize under his breath. The colonel began speaking about service, about sacrifice, about the men and women whose names were etched into bronze and remembered in folded flags. He was good at it, better than anyone Elena had expected. Not polished in the empty way some speakers were, but careful, as if every word had been weighed before it was allowed into the air. Several people wiped at their eyes before he had even reached the part of the speech everyone was waiting for. When he finally said Luke's name, the room changed. Grief moved through it like weather. A woman in the second row bowed her head. One of the veterans shut his eyes. Someone near the kitchen exhaled a breath that sounded almost like prayer. Elena tightened her grip on the coffee pot until the metal handle pressed hard into her palm. Captain Luke Whitaker, the colonel said, lived the values he swore to uphold. Duty, loyalty, selfless service. He died making sure his people had a chance to come home. Elena looked away, because that part was true, and because the rest never came. No one in that room knew what Luke had sounded like in his final minutes. No one knew the dust had turned the air so thick it felt like swallowing sand. No one knew he had been afraid. Not cowardly, never that, but human. No one knew he had been lying half inside a wrecked vehicle with blood soaking through Elena's gloves while gunfire cracked over the ridge line and the radio screamed 3 commands at once. The story everyone preferred was cleaner. The kind people could place inside a frame and set on a table beside a folded flag. Heroes died bravely. Fathers survived by believing it. A small boy at the back of the room tugged at his grandmother's sleeve. His whisper carried farther than he meant it to. Why's that soldier serving coffee if she's in uniform too? Half the table turned. Elena felt the heat rise up her neck before anyone's eyes could fully find her. The grandmother shushed the boy, embarrassed, but the question stayed in the air like something fragile and dangerous. A few guests glanced from Elena to the head table and back again, as though the answer might be written somewhere between the silver urns and the flag by the podium. Colonel Whitaker did not look at her. Not yet. He kept speaking. Elena, move. The protocol sergeant had whispered earlier when she hesitated near the doorway. Nobody's making you disappear. You're doing that yourself. Maybe he had been right. Or maybe there were some rooms where the safest place for a wounded heart was behind a tray, where people accepted your silence because they had already assigned you a smaller role. Elena had not come for recognition. She had come because the envelope in her pocket had become too heavy to carry one more year. She had told herself she would wait until the crowd thinned, hand it to the colonel privately, answer whatever question he asked, and leave before the look in his eyes could finish what guilt had started long ago. But guilt did not behave politely in the presence of memory. It pushed. It returned. It made cowards out of otherwise disciplined people. As the speeches continued, a retired command sergeant major near the rear table watched Elena more closely than the others. He had the kind of face war carved in deep lines and refused to smooth back out. When she reached to refill his cup, he noticed the scar on the inside of her wrist, pale and rope-thin, and the way her right hand trembled only after she set the pot down. "You okay, soldier?" he asked quietly. She gave him the answer people offered when the truth would take too long. "Yes, Sergeant Major." His eyes dropped for a second to the black apron covering her chest, then back to her face. Whatever he thought, he kept it to himself. But he did something no one else had done that morning. He stood when she turned to leave his table. Not fully, not enough to interrupt the room, just enough to show respect. It unsettled her more than pity would have. At the podium, Colonel Whitaker reached the portion of his speech devoted to Luke's final operation. He did not name the village. He did not name the ridge. He did not mention how many soldiers came home in medevac aircraft or how many came home under flags. He said only that his son died in the act of protecting others, and that there had been courage from everyone in the convoy. From everyone. A soft, generous phrase. And still Elena flinched. Because sometimes a partial truth cut deeper than a lie. There had been courage from everyone in the convoy except, for one terrible stretch of seconds, from Elena herself, or so she had believed every night since. No official report could erase the moment she had frozen beside the burning vehicle, hearing Luke shout her name while one wounded specialist bled at her boots and another screamed from inside twisted metal. Training said, treat the living. Instinct said, run into the fire. Duty said, decide now and live with it forever. She had chosen. And 4 men had still died. That was the part people never understood about medals. They gleamed because grief had first scorched them clean. Elena drifted back toward the kitchen while the colonel's voice filled the hall. In the stainless steel reflection of the service counter, she caught sight of herself. Dark hair pulled tight beneath the edge of her service cap, jaw set too hard, apron tied over a uniform she had almost not worn. Behind her, steam rose in thin, ghost-like ribbons from the urns. For a moment the room beyond the swinging door blurred, and she was no longer in a community hall at Fort Moore, but crouched behind a tire blown off its axle, pressing gauze into a wound that would not stop filling her hands. She heard Luke again. Not the legend. The man. Ruiz, he had rasped, fighting for air. Look at me. She had looked, and wished she hadn't. Not because she feared dying. Because she knew he was about to ask her for something she would not be able to refuse. A burst of applause from the hall pulled her back. Another speaker had taken the microphone, a local councilman praising military families. Elena lifted a fresh pot and returned to the floor. She kept her chin level. Soldiers learned early that composure could become a kind of armor, and she wore hers the way some people wore medals. Carefully, visibly, and at a cost. Near the head table, a woman with pearl earrings extended her cup without waiting for Elena to stop. My husband says these breakfasts are important for morale, she said to no one in particular. People need stories of real heroes. Elena poured without spilling a drop. Real heroes. The phrase should have slid past her. Instead it lodged somewhere sharp. At the empty chair, a single white rose lay beside Luke's place setting. It had not been there earlier. Elena had no idea who had placed it there, but the sight of it tightened something in her chest. Luke had hated ceremonial flowers. On deployment, he once told her they were the kind of thing people sent when they wanted to feel helpful from a safe distance. Then he had apologized immediately because her mother kept a rose garden in New Mexico, and Luke had always noticed the details that mattered to other people. She remembered that too. The annoying, human, unheroic details. How he drank bad instant coffee because it reminded him of field problems when he was a cadet. How he carried a tiny notebook in his cargo pocket and wrote things down nobody else thought to remember. How he called his father sir even on personal phone calls, not out of fear, but because some habits were inherited deeper than blood. How, 3 days before the ambush, he had found Elena sitting alone behind the aid station after a difficult casualty evacuation and handed her half a peanut butter cracker without a word. He had not asked whether she was all right. He had known she wasn't. He had simply sat there until the silence did its work. People in memorial halls did not tell those stories. They told cleaner ones. At 11:30, as the breakfast plates were cleared and the final remarks approached, the room had relaxed enough for conversation to return in low waves. That was when Staff Sergeant Malik Boone entered through the side door, leaning on a cane, his dress uniform stretched awkwardly over the brace on his left knee. The conversations nearest the entrance faded first. Then more heads turned. A few veterans rose instinctively. Boone had been in the convoy too. Elena saw him before he saw her and nearly dropped the tray. He looked older than 30. War had a talent for that. But the set of his mouth was unchanged, and so was the intensity in his gaze when he finally spotted her by the coffee service. For a second he simply stared. Then he started toward her, each step deliberate, the cane striking the floor with a hollow click that seemed too loud for the room. "Doc," he said. It was not a greeting. It was a recognition. The word carried. Several nearby guests turned. The retired sergeant major straightened in his chair. Even the councilman at the lectern faltered and glanced up from his notes. Elena felt every eye in the vicinity shift toward her, searching her face for meaning she had no strength left to hide. Boone stopped in front of her. Emotion tightened his voice, but he kept it steady. "You weren't going to tell me you'd be here?" "I wasn't planning to stay long," she said. His eyes dropped to the apron tied over her uniform, then returned to her face. Pain crossed them, followed by something harder to bear. "Respect. They've got you serving coffee?" "I asked for this detail." "Why?" She could have said because sitting beneath Luke's photograph felt impossible. Because hearing his father thank the room for remembering a story that was missing its center made her want to walk straight back out the side door. Because the envelope in her pocket had become a second heartbeat, and she no longer trusted herself to hear one more speech before giving it away. Instead, she said, "Because I needed somewhere to stand." Boone understood too quickly. That was the problem with survivors. They needed fewer words. He lowered his voice. He should know. The sentence struck her like cold water. At the head table, Colonel Whitaker was listening to someone introduce the final portion of the program. He had not yet noticed Boone. He had not yet looked at Elena in any meaningful way. The distance between them was barely 20 feet, but it held 2 years of silence. Elena swallowed. "And if knowing breaks whatever peace he has left?" Boone's jaw tightened. His answer came after a long pause. "And if not knowing keeps breaking you?" There it was. The question she had spent 2 years outrunning. Not whether Luke had been brave. He had. Not whether the colonel deserved the letter. He did. But whether preserving one man's idea of his son was worth the slow destruction of the soldier his son had fought to save. That was the moral weight Elena had carried into the hall that morning. Not truth or lies. Mercy or honesty. Which wound did a person choose when both seemed cruel? Before Boone could say more, applause rolled through the room again. Colonel Whitaker was being called back to the podium for closing remarks. Boone stepped aside reluctantly. Elena moved toward the head table because the coffee service still had to continue, because hands obeying routine gave the mind somewhere to hide, because if she stopped moving the fear might finally catch her. At the podium, the colonel adjusted his glasses and unfolded a final page. The hall quieted with that strange obedience grief commands from strangers. He thanked the organizers once more. He thanked the veterans. He thanked the families whose private burdens became public symbols more often than anyone should ask them to. Then, after a breath longer than the others, he said something that made Elena go very still. "I used to believe memory was strongest when spoken aloud," he said. "Lately, I'm not so sure. Sometimes what honors the fallen most is not speech, but the unfinished duty the living still owe them." His gaze remained on the paper, but Elena felt the words land. As if somewhere beneath formality, beneath rank and ritual, another human being in that room was also standing on the edge of something unfinished and did not yet know how to cross it. She began to think perhaps she could do it. Not publicly, not here, but soon, after the last applause, after the line of handshakes, after the room loosened enough to let her reach him. Then the auxiliary woman at the side table waved her over with a frantic little gesture. The colonel's cup was empty. For one absurd, piercing moment, Elena wanted to laugh. After all the years, after the blood and radios and folded flags and sleepless nights, it was coffee that would bring her back to him. She picked up the silver pot and walked to the head table. The closer she came, the more visible the details became. The colonel's left hand resting near his notes. The faint crease in the paper where it had been folded and unfolded too many times. The small framed photograph near Luke's empty chair. A young captain smiling in the flat daylight of some long-ago field exercise, patrol cap tipped back, confidence bright and careless in his face. He looked younger there than Elena remembered him. She stopped at the colonel's shoulder. "Coffee, sir?" she asked. He lifted his cup without looking. That should have been the entire moment. A simple refill. Nothing more. But as Elena tipped the pot, a child darted between chairs near the aisle and bumped the corner of the table. Not hard. Just enough. The stream of coffee jerked off course. A dark line splashed across Elena's apron. Someone gasped. She set the pot down immediately and stepped back. apologizing, more to the room than to the colonel. "It's all right," he said automatically, finally turning toward her. She reached for the knot at the back of the apron, wanting only to get the stained cloth off before it soaked through. Her fingers were clumsy for the first time all morning. The knot loosened, the apron slid down, and the room changed. Sunlight from the tall side windows hit the left side of her uniform just as the black fabric dropped away. On the dark blue wool of her army service jacket, above the neat row of ribbons and beside the combat medical badge, a silver star medal caught the light and flashed once like a blade. Not gaudy, not theatrical, just unmistakable. Colonel Whitaker saw it. Then he saw her nameplate. Ruiz. The last word on his tongue died before it could leave his mouth. He did not blink. He did not move. The color drained from his face so suddenly that Boone half rose from his chair 3 tables away. The colonel's hand tightened around the edge of the tablecloth. His eyes lifted from the medal to Elena's face with a disbelief so raw it stripped 20 years of command from him in an instant. When he spoke, the first attempt made no sound. The second was barely more than a breath. "Specialist. Ruiz." Every conversation in the hall stopped. Elena felt the silence gather around them, heavy and complete. Somewhere near the back, a spoon slipped against a saucer. No one turned toward the noise. No one looked anywhere except the space between the colonel and the medic standing beside his son's empty chair. "Yes, sir," she said. There was 1,000 things she might have said after that. "I'm sorry. He wasn't alone. I tried. Your son made me promise. I should have come sooner." None of them reached her lips. Colonel Whitaker pushed back his chair so abruptly it struck the floor behind him. He remained standing only because instinct kept him upright. His gaze had dropped back to the medal, as though it had rewritten the room around him. Elena knew what he was seeing even before he asked. "Who?" He stopped, swallowed, tried again. "Who awarded you that?" The question was not really about the army. It was about the story he had been telling himself. Elena reached into the inside pocket of her jacket. The envelope had lived there so long it felt warm from her body. She held it in both hands for a second before offering it across the table. "Your son made sure they knew what happened, sir," she said quietly. "This was with me when they brought me back." The colonel looked at the envelope as if it might detonate. On the front, in faded ink smudged by time and handling, were 4 words. "For my father, Luke Whitaker." Something in the colonel's face collapsed, not outward, not dramatically, but inward, the way old buildings fail when one hidden beam finally gives way. His fingers trembled as he took the envelope. Around them, chairs remained motionless. Veterans who had seen combat, funerals, and flag-draped transfer cases stood frozen with their hands at their sides because they knew, with that instinct born of hard years, that the room had just entered sacred ground. The colonel stared at the handwriting for a long moment before carefully opening the envelope along the crease. A single folded page slid into his hand. He unfolded it once, twice. Elena watched his eyes move. The silence deepened. Then the colonel began to read aloud, not because he intended to, but because somewhere between the first line and the second, his control failed him and grief no longer cared whether it was private. "Dad," he read, his voice fraying at the edges. "If this reaches you, it means Ruiz ignored at least one direct order, which probably won't surprise you if you ever meet her." A startled, almost broken laugh passed through a few throats in the room, then died instantly. The colonel kept reading. "She's the reason men are getting home. Don't let anyone tell the story wrong just because I didn't. I made a call. She made the hard ones. She went back into the vehicle after the first rounds hit. She got Bell out. She got Boone breathing again. She was trying to drag me when I told her to stop. If my name is remembered more than hers, then it means people chose the easier version. Don't choose that." The colonel stopped. His mouth opened once, then shut. There were tears in the eyes of men who clearly had not cried in public for years. Elena could no longer feel her hands. The letter trembled in Colonel Whitaker's grip as he forced himself onward. "I know what you'll tell people about me. You'll say duty. You'll say service. Maybe even courage. I hope some of that is true. But if you want the truth, here it is. I was scared. Everyone was. Ruiz was scared too, and she still kept moving. That matters. Tell her mother she raised someone braver than most officers I've met. And if Ruiz ever blames herself, don't let her. What happened out here belongs to war, not to one medic with burned hands trying to save everybody. By the time he reached the final lines, the colonel could barely see the page. I'm sorry for whatever this does to you. I know what it means to be your son. Today I needed to be their captain instead. Be kind to her, if you can. She'll carry enough without your anger adding to it. The letter slipped slightly in his fingers. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. Then Colonel Benjamin Whitaker did something no one in that room would forget for the rest of their lives. He stepped away from the podium, away from the microphone, away from the safety of prepared remarks and public composure. He came around the head table until he stood directly in front of Specialist Elena Ruiz. Up close, he looked not like a colonel, not like a decorated officer, not like the father from newspaper photographs. He looked like a man who had just met the last witness to his son. I was wrong, he said. His voice cracked on the final word. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. Elena's breath caught. She had imagined many versions of this meeting in sleepless hours and long drives and empty barracks rooms. In none of them had he apologized first. I read the official summary, he continued, forcing the words through grief that plainly did not want to make room for them. I accepted what was easiest to live with. Then I heard other things. Bits and pieces. Enough to make me angry, and not enough to make me fair. He looked at the medal again, then back at her. And all this time, you were carrying his letter. Elena finally answered the truth instead of the smallest possible version of it. I tried to come 3 times, sir. The room stayed silent, listening. The first time I got as far as the visitor gate and turned around. The second time I sat in the parking lot for 2 hours and couldn't get out of the car. The third time, she glanced at the empty chair. The third time I thought if I kept moving, maybe I could do it. The colonel closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, whatever command voice remained had been replaced by something quieter and infinitely harder. What were his last moments like? That was the real question. Not how he died. Who he was while dying. Elena could have protected him with a cleaner story. The room would have allowed it. The father standing in front of her might even have preferred it. But Luke had asked for the harder truth. Not because it was painful, because it was human. He was worried about his people, she said. About Belle. About Boone. About the gunner in the second truck. A faint, fragile smile touched her mouth and vanished. And he was worried you'd be angry he disobeyed standing orders. A broken sound escaped the colonel that might have been laughter if grief had not claimed it first. He kept trying to talk while I was treating him. Elena continued. I told him to save his strength. He said that was rich, coming from someone who never followed her own advice. A few soldiers lowered their heads. Boone wiped at his eyes with the heel of his hand. He knew what was happening, sir. He wasn't confused. He wasn't alone. And he wasn't thinking about himself at the end. The colonel's shoulders shook once. That was all. Just once. Then he did the thing that became the image everyone remembered. He came to attention in front of her. An aging colonel, father of the fallen captain, standing inches from the medic who had carried his son's final words for 2 years. His shoes aligned. His chin lifted. The grief remained plain in his face, but now it stood beside something stronger than pride and gentler than remorse. Respect. He raised his right hand in a full, formal salute. For half a heartbeat, Elena froze. Then instinct, training, and something deeper than both brought her own hand up in return. Her salute was steady this time. So was her gaze. Around them, the retired sergeant major rose first. Then Boone. Then the 2 old infantrymen. Then the auxiliary women, the councilman, the banker who had snapped for coffee, the families, the strangers, the veterans. Chairs pushed back across the hall in a wave. Several men removed their caps. A woman near the front covered her mouth and sobbed openly. Even the photographer lowered his camera for a second, as if he understood there were moments too sacred to trap immediately. No one had been told to stand. They stood anyway. Colonel Whitaker held the salute for his son's medic longer than protocol required. Long enough for everyone in the room to understand that something had just been put right. Not perfectly, not completely, but truthfully. When he lowered his hand, he turned to the empty chair at the head table. For a moment, he only looked at it. Then he pulled it back himself. Specialist Ruiz, he said, his voice quieter now, but fully intact. If you can forgive an old man for not seeing you sooner, I would be honored if you took this seat. The hall remained motionless. That chair had been meant for memory. Now it was being offered to the person who had been carrying it alone. Elena stared at the place card with Luke's name. Her first instinct was refusal. Not from modesty, from fear. Sitting there felt too close to everything she had survived, and too near everything she still had not forgiven in herself. She looked at Boone. He nodded once. She looked at the retired sergeant major. He bowed his head, as if granting permission. Finally, she looked back at Colonel Whitaker and saw no command in him at all, only request. So she stepped forward. Before sitting, she lifted Luke's place card with both hands and held it gently against the white rose. Not erasing him, making room beside him. It was such a small gesture that half the room inhaled at once. Then she sat. Colonel Whitaker returned to the podium, but he did not pick up the prepared remarks again. He folded them once and set them aside. "I came here to speak about sacrifice," he said, facing the hall. "Instead, I was given a chance to witness it." His eyes moved toward Elena, then back to the room. "For 2 years, some of us have been honoring a version of courage that fit neatly into our grief. Today we were reminded that real courage is usually messier than memory allows. It shakes, it bleeds, it doubts itself, and still it keeps moving." No one dared interrupt. "My son died a captain," he continued. "This morning I learned again that he also died a soldier who trusted his medic more than he trusted his own chances. That matters to me. It should matter to all of us." He lifted Luke's letter slightly. "We do no honor to the dead by making the living smaller." The line entered the room and stayed there. Later, people would quote it in newspaper columns and at VFW dinners and under social media posts where strangers argued about courage as if they understood its cost. But in that hall, in that moment, it was not a slogan. It was a correction. And corrections, when honest enough, can sound like mercy. The rest of the program dissolved into something more human than ceremony. The councilman abandoned his closing remarks altogether. The chaplain offered a prayer so brief it felt almost like breathing. People lined up not to congratulate Elena but to thank her, which she bore awkwardly, as though gratitude sat on her shoulders less comfortably than blame ever had. The banker who had snapped for coffee stood in front of her with tears in his eyes and apologized without excuse. Elena accepted it with a simple nod. Shame was already doing the rest of the work. A Gold Star mother touched Elena's sleeve and whispered, "Thank you for telling him the truth." Boone stayed nearby, not hovering, just present. At one point, the little boy who had asked why she was serving coffee approached with all the solemn seriousness only children and soldiers can manage. He looked at the silver star on her chest, then at the empty chair beside her. "Was Captain Whitaker your friend?" he asked. Elena's answer took a second to form. "Yes," she said. "He was." The boy considered that carefully, then said the most devastatingly simple thing in the room all day. "Then I'm glad you came." So was she, though the gladness hurt in places healing always does. By early afternoon, the hall had thinned. White cups sat abandoned in saucers. Programs lay folded on tables. Sunlight shifted farther across the polished floor, warming the places where strangers had stood shoulder to shoulder without rank or status matching much at all. Elena helped stack chairs because movement still steadied her. Nobody tried to stop her this time. Nobody mistook her for staff. The apron was gone. Colonel Whitaker found her near the side door, where the noise from the kitchen could not reach. He no longer looked like a man bracing for ceremony. He looked tired, hollowed out, and strangely lighter for it. "There was one part of the report I never asked to see," he said. "The witness statements. I thought I was protecting what I had left." He paused. "Truth doesn't stop existing because we're too hurt to face it, does it?" Elena thought of all the nights she had spent answering that question with silence. "No, sir," she said. "It just waits." He gave a slow, rueful nod. Then, after a hesitation that made him look older than anything else had that day, he asked, "Did he suffer very long?" There it was again, that impossible territory between love and endurance where only honesty belongs. "No," Elena said softly. "Long enough to know he wasn't leaving his people behind. Long enough to ask me twice whether you'd blame yourself." Her eyes held his. "I told him you wouldn't." The colonel drew in a breath that seemed to ache on its way through him. "Thank you," he said. This time the gratitude was not public, not ceremonial, just a father receiving the final mercy a witness can offer. He looked down at the medal on her uniform. "He was right, you know." "About what?" "That if his name was remembered more than yours, people were choosing the easier version." Elena let out a quiet breath that might once have become a laugh in another life. People like easier versions, sir. He studied her for a moment, then said, I did too. It was not self-pity. It was confession. Something inside Elena, some rusted hinge of old anger and older shame, shifted. Forgiveness did not arrive like thunder. It came the way light enters a dark room through blinds, narrow at first, almost cautious, until enough of it exists to change what everything looks like. She would still wake up some nights hearing the ridge. She would still remember the heat, the blood, the choice she had made under fire. Luke would still be dead. Medals did not reverse that. Apologies did not erase it. But the story she had been carrying alone was no longer locked inside her. That mattered, more than she expected. Before he left, Colonel Whitaker reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and removed a small object wrapped in handkerchief cloth. He unfolded it carefully in his palm. Inside lay a worn bronze challenge coin, edges smoothed by years of being carried. Luke took this on every field exercise from West Point onward, he said. His mother used to say it was superstition. He said it was habit. He extended it toward her. I think he'd want you to have it. Elena stared at the coin without taking it. I can't, sir. Yes, you can. His voice softened. He trusted you with his last words. Let an old man trust you with something smaller. When she finally accepted it, her fingers closed around metal still warm from his hand. It was heavier than it looked. So was everything worth keeping? They walked out of the hall together a few minutes later, not side by side like equals in rank, but not divided by silence anymore either. Outside, the afternoon had turned clear and bright. Flags along the entrance stirred in a measured wind. A maintenance crew was already taking down extra folding tables. Life, indifferent and faithful, had resumed its ordinary motion around the place where grief had just changed shape. At the base of the front steps stood the photographer from the local paper. He lifted the camera, hesitated, and asked permission with his eyes rather than his mouth. Colonel Whitaker glanced at Elena. She gave the smallest nod. The image he captured would travel farther than either of them expected. A young army medic in dress blues, silver star bright against her chest, standing beside an older colonel whose expression held equal parts sorrow and pride. Between them, no rank visible enough to matter. Only understanding. Behind them, through the glass doors, the empty chair still faintly visible at the head table. It became the photograph people shared when they wanted to talk about service without sounding political, about sacrifice without exaggeration, about the military not as myth, but as a collection of human beings trying to carry what war leaves behind. Veterans wrote to Elena after that. Gold Star parents did too. Some told her about their sons. Some told her about their daughters. A few confessed there were truths in their own homes still waiting to be faced. She answered when she could. Months later, Boone would tell her that more soldiers probably found peace in that one breakfast than in a year of carefully worded speeches. Elena would shrug it off at first. Then she would think of the room standing, the colonel saluting, the little boy asking the only honest question anyone had asked all morning, and she would begin to believe him. Not because one moment heals everything. Because one truthful moment can begin to heal what denial never could. On the anniversary of the ambush, Elena returned to the military cemetery alone. She wore civilian clothes that day, not uniform, and carried no speech, no program, no polished version of anything. Just the bronze coin in one pocket and a fresh white rose in her hand. She stood before Luke Whitaker's grave in the clean morning quiet and told him, out loud, that she had finally done what he asked. The wind moved lightly through the flags. Somewhere in the distance, a bugle practiced notes that did not yet become a song. Elena placed the rose, rested her fingertips for a moment against the cool stone, and let herself breathe without rushing the next breath. For the first time in 2 years, she did not rehearse alternate endings in her head. She did not relive the exact second. She chose one wounded man over another. She did not measure her worth against the dead. She simply stood there, present. And when she finally turned to leave, she did not look like someone walking away from judgment. She looked like someone walking back toward life. Honor is not what we say about courage after the battle. It is whether we tell the truth about who carried it. And somewhere between the smell of bitter coffee and the hush of a room finally made honest, a young soldier who had come to disappear was finally seen. If this story stayed with you, If it reminded you that dignity, sacrifice, and quiet courage still exist in the world, consider subscribing and becoming part of this community. And if you feel like sharing, tell me which moment touched you most, or whether you think Elena waited too long to give him that letter. Stories like this live on because people carry them together.